I have been asked, more times than I can count, why I chose a human. The question always carries the same weight beneath it, the same architecture of assumptions pressing against the words. Why would an empress of the Rethassian line, heir to the Concordance throne, daughter of a dynasty that had governed 3 systems for 11 generations, select as her bond consort a creature from a world that had managed to stop killing itself in organized ways about 40 years prior? The questioners phrase it differently depending on their rank and their courage. A few have been honest enough to ask it to my face, sitting in the carved chairs of my receiving room with the composure of people who believe that honesty of a certain sort is a form of service. Most ask it in the galleries, in the antechambers, in the long corridors of the Hall of Concordance where whispers travel the way water finds cracks in stone, patient, persistent, finding every opening. What I tell them when I bother to answer at all is this. I chose Cale Morrow because I watched him sit across a table from a man who had ordered the deaths of 11,000 people, and I watched Cale make that man's certainty collapse, not with force, not with threats, not with the machinery of empire, but with a file of documents that the man had believed for 30 years were safely buried. Cale did not raise his voice. He did not stand up from the table. He simply read, in a quiet and deliberate voice, from one document to the next, and he paused at the end of each one and waited for the silence to settle, and the silence was the verdict. I was there as a neutral observer. My government had sent me to witness the proceedings at the Harath arbitration, a formality, a diplomatic courtesy between Rethassian interests and the tribunal. I was not supposed to form opinions. I was certainly not supposed to find myself watching the human arbiter more than the defendant, trying to understand what quality a person could possess that would make documented truth feel like a physical force. There was nothing theatrical about Cale. He was lean, not particularly tall by human standards, with the kind of face that has been weathered into its final shape by some combination of years and attention. A face that looked like it had been used to think very hard about difficult things for a long time. He wore the dark professional attire of his guild without affectation, and he sat in his chair as though sitting were something he had decided to do efficiently. And when he read the way a craftsman uses a tool, with total concentration and no wasted motion. I told myself on the transport home that it was professional admiration. I told myself that for almost a year. His name came up again 8 months later, in a different context. A jurisdictional dispute between 2 of my own vassal territories. A tangle of competing claims over mineral rights and succession protocols that had been unresolved for 6 years and had cost lives, not in open conflict, but in the slow administrative violence of communities left without governance. My advisors recommended 3 arbiters from our established roster. I requested Cale Morrow instead. My senior counselor, advisor Yenny's Thal, gave me the look she reserves for decisions she considers beneath my station and above my stubbornness. A particular arrangement of her features, a kind of dignified disapproval that she has been perfecting for 20 years and delivers without a word. He resolved the dispute in 11 days, the 6-year knot untied in 11 days. He did it the same way he had done the Harath work, by reading the existing record more carefully than anyone had read it before, by finding the points where competing claims intersected rather than diverged, by producing a documented finding that neither party could reasonably refuse because its foundation was their own prior agreements read correctly. When I reviewed the finding, what struck me was not its intelligence, though it was intelligent, but its patience. The quality of time and attention that had gone into understanding every piece of material before moving a single one of them. A builder's patience, the kind that produces things that last. I told myself after that it was gratitude. By the time I stopped lying to myself, it was already too late for anything sensible, and I have never been particularly interested in the sensible path when a more honest one was available. I told him plainly what I thought of him. I was aware that this was an unusual conversation for an empress to initiate, and I conducted it with what I hoped was the directness it deserved rather than the ceremony it didn't. He received it without performance, no flattery, no false modesty, no strategic deflection. He told me, with the directness that I had come to understand was simply how he was made, that he thought a great deal of me as well, and had since the Harath proceedings, and had considered it entirely none of his business to say so. We were bonded 11 months later, in a private ceremony attended by my household staff, my sister Veth, and a registrar who had the good sense not to comment on the unusual nature of the occasion. The court did not take it quietly. I had expected opposition. What I had not expected was the particular form it took, which was not open hostility, not at first, but something more refined and more dangerous. Patience. They were patient about it. Subvoiced Dramal Seth, who led the senior advisory faction and who had been positioning his own preferred candidates for my consideration since the day my mother died, was patient about it for 4 years. He smiled in the corridors. He bowed at the correct depth. He addressed Kale by his title Consort Select with a precision that was itself a kind of contempt. The title exact and technically correct, delivered in a tone that removed all meaning from it, the way you can drain water from a vessel by holding it a certain way, not violation of protocol, hollowing of it. My advisors told me I was imagining the hostility. Thal, who never tells me I am imagining anything, said only that Seth was a man of considerable experience managing transitions, and that managing them sometimes required patience with circumstances one found suboptimal. This was, from Thal, the equivalent of a detailed threat assessment. Kale noticed. He noticed everything, in the way that people notice things when noticing is the skill that has kept them effective for 2 decades, not anxiously, not with alarm, but with the steady ongoing awareness of a man cataloging information for later use. He said very little about Seth, because Kale said very little about most things until he had decided what needed to be said, but I saw him watching the subvoice in the way he had watched the defendant at the Harath proceedings. The same quality of attention. Not wary, not anxious, calibrating. What I did not know for those 4 years was that Seth was not only being patient, he was building something. Document by document, alliance by alliance, in the archive rooms and the sealed chambers, and the long diplomatic correspondence that flows through a government the way blood flows through a body, unseen, constant, purposeful. He was constructing a case, not the honest kind. The other kind, the kind assembled from carefully selected truths and deliberately omitted context, the kind that looks like justice from a distance and is something else entirely when you get close enough to read it. The petition arrived on a Tuesday. I remember that detail because Tuesdays, by a domestic arrangement that had become something of a private joke between us, were the days Kale made breakfast. He had a particular approach to the morning meal that I had never been able to explain to my household staff to their satisfaction. A combination of techniques from his home continent and ingredients that were never quite what he intended because galactic procurement is an imperfect science. But the results were consistently better than anything the staff produced. And the ritual of it, the ordinary human act of a man standing in a kitchen and making food for the 2 of them, had become one of the things I valued most about my mornings. It was the most ordinary thing in my life, in a life that had very little ordinary in it, that mattered more than I had expected it to, when I first understood what I was building with this man. The petition arrived while we were eating. A sealed communication, formal stamp, convocation priority routing, which means it bypasses the standard household review and comes directly to me. I read the first page standing at the table because I had not yet sat down, and I made myself finish the first page before I let my face do anything. It was formatted as a convocation inquiry, technically a neutral instrument, a mechanism by which the senior advisory body can request that the Empress appear before the assembled chamber to answer questions of constitutional significance. In practice, it had not been invoked in my dynasty's history. The mechanism exists, but invoking it is the kind of move that requires absolute certainty of outcome, because an empress who appears before the convocation and prevails walks away stronger, and one who appears and fails does not walk away in any meaningful sense. Seth had decided he was certain. The constitutional question, as framed in the petition, was whether my bond to Kael Morrow satisfied the requirements of the Rethassian Concordance Compact, specifically the provision that the imperial consort must be, in the original language, a being of recognized standing within galactic law. The petition argued, in 40 pages of meticulous legal construction, that a human from a world that had held observer status in the galactic community for fewer than 50 years could not be considered a being of recognized standing. It further argued that the bond itself was therefore fraudulent, not in intent, perhaps, but in law, and that my fitness to govern was complicated by my failure to uphold the foundational compact of my own dynasty. 40 pages of careful scholarship, of precedent and reference and impeccable citation, all assembled toward a conclusion that had been decided before a single word was written. 40 pages. He had been working on them for years. Kael read it over my shoulder while I was still on the 3rd page. He moved through text the way he moves through everything, efficiently, with full comprehension, not performing the pace of reading but simply reading. I felt him still when he reached the central argument, the particular quality of stillness he has when something has engaged his full attention, and then I felt him exhale, not in distress, not in anger, but in the way a person exhales when they have just identified the shape of a problem and are already several steps into considering its solution. "He's been planning this since before the bonding," Kael said. "It was not a question." "Yes. He'll have the numbers in the chamber." "Probably." A silence. Outside the kitchen window, the gardens were doing the specific thing they do in early morning, the light coming through the upper canopy in long horizontal lines, the sound of whatever birds had taken up residence in the eastern section that Kael had been meaning to identify for 2 years and had not yet gotten around to. An ordinary morning. The kind of morning that belongs to people who have managed to build something worth protecting and who are now required to protect it. "I'd like to see the convocation archive," he said. I looked at him. "The full archive," he said, "not summaries, the primary documents, the sealed correspondence, everything the chamber has produced since the compact was drafted if they'll permit access." He paused. "They may not permit it." "They will permit it," I said, "because refusing to permit it would itself become part of the record, and Seth is too careful for that." "Good." He folded the petition with the same deliberate tidiness he brought to everything, squared corners, neat, the instinct of a man who has handled thousands of documents and cannot quite suppress the professional habit of treating each one correctly. He set it beside his plate. "Then I need about 2 weeks. I appeared before the convocation on the 14th day, because the compact requires a response within 15 days, and I had no intention of using the grace period. Appearing on the 14th day was a statement. It said that I had not needed the full time, that I was not scrambling, that whatever they had built with their years of patience had not found me unprepared. I will not say that the intervening 14 days were easy. They were not. The petition was public by the 2nd day. These things always are, in a court that runs on information as its primary currency, and what followed was the particular kind of quiet that precedes things. Advisors who would normally seek an audience did not. Allies who normally initiated contact were suddenly requiring time to assess their positions. The diplomatic communication that is the blood of any governing body slowed, in the way blood slows when a body is waiting to see whether the wound is mortal. Thal managed it. She is very good at managing the things that are public and requires very little guidance from me in doing so. What she cannot manage, and has never tried to manage, is what happens in private, which is to say the kitchen mornings and the late evenings and the particular quality of a life that is being lived by two people who have decided that their investment in each other is not contingent on whether the investment is currently advantageous. Cale was in the archive rooms. He asked for a particular kind of quiet during those 2 weeks, not distance, not the absence of companionship, but the absence of questions about his work. I gave it to him. We ate together in the evenings, and I did not ask, and he did not offer anything except, on the 4th evening, the observation that the Rethassian record-keeping system was remarkable. Remarkable how? I said. Complete, he said. He was looking at something only he could currently see, the particular expression of a person who is holding a great deal of information in active arrangement. They documented everything. I did not press him. I had learned in 7 years that some things he would tell me when they were ready to be told, and pressing made them less ready, not more. I did not fully understand what he meant until I was standing on the throne dais, looking out over the Hall of Concordance in full session, watching Subvoice Seth's opening address and feeling, for the first time since the petition arrived, something other than cold calculation about the odds. The Hall of Concordance is not designed for comfort. It was designed for weight, for the specific gravity of consequence. The walls are carved obsidian from the original quarries of the First Imperial period, and the veined stone of the floor is a mineral that absorbs sound at certain frequencies, which means that the silence in the hall, when silence truly falls, has a particular quality. It is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something heavier. My mother used to say that the hall had heard too much history to pretend that anything said within it was ordinary. The tiered galleries were full. They are usually full for convocation sessions of consequence. The senior advisors ranked in their formal positions, the diplomatic observers in their designated sections, the household staff and minor functionaries filling the upper tiers in quiet rows. Today there were additional observers, representatives of 3 allied courts, which I noted were the same courts whose ambassadors had been in communication with the advisory faction in the past 18 months. Seth intended this to be witnessed. A verdict witnessed by allied courts becomes, in the language of galactic politics, something closer to consensus. He was not only trying to unseat the bond, he was trying to write the outcome into the wider record of galactic opinion. The standing circle at the center of the floor was empty, waiting. Seth delivered his opening address with the careful elegance that had made him formidable for 4 decades. He did not grandstand. He did not perform contempt. He was too skilled for that. He was measured and thorough and technically impeccable, and the 40 pages of the petition became, in his delivery, something that sounded almost like regret, a man sorrowing over a constitutional necessity. He had the deepest respect for the Empress. He had devoted his career to the dynasty's integrity. But the compact was the foundation of everything they had built, and the dynasty's integrity required that the question be answered honestly. And the question, clearly and without malice, was whether the bond could be considered valid under the law that all of them served. He did not look at Cale throughout the address, not once. The deliberateness of it was its own message. You are beneath my acknowledgement. You do not exist in this room as anything that merits a glance. The galleries watched. I watched the galleries watch. In the diplomatic observer section, heads leaned toward each other, small words exchanged behind raised hands. The Allied court representatives had their recording instruments active. In the upper tiers, the faces of the household staff showed the particular careful blankness of people who are watching something consequential, and have learned that demonstrating reaction is inadvisable. My own address was brief. I had consulted with my legal counselors and I had listened to their recommendations, and I had then, with great respect, set those recommendations aside and written my own response. What I said, in essence, was this. The question of my consort's standing was not a question of species origin. It was a question of documented record, and I was prepared to allow the record to speak. I then named Cale Morrow as the arbiter who would present the evidentiary case on my behalf. The murmur that went through the gallery was not subtle. I watched it travel the tiers the way sound travels through a stone building, bouncing off surfaces, finding resonance. An arbiter is a recognized role in convocation proceedings, but the arbiter is typically a legal counselor of long standing, a member of the established galactic bar, a figure whose credentials pre-exist the session they are called to serve. Naming your own consort, the person whose standing is itself under question, as the arbiter of your defense was either a statement of extraordinary confidence or a profound miscalculation. And from the sound of the gallery, opinion was dividing along the lines of those who understood something about Cale and those who did not. The majority did not. Seth, for the first time, looked at Cale. It was a brief look, 2, perhaps 3 seconds, not contemptuous. Contempt implies some engagement with the thing you feel it toward. What Seth's look communicated was closer to the particular disinterest a careful, experienced man shows when he has encountered something he has already accounted for and found negligible. He had anticipated this possibility. He had decided it did not matter. He was smiling by the time he looked away. Cale walked to the standing circle. I want to describe this accurately because I have replayed it a great many times since, and what struck me then, what strikes me still, years after, was the quality of his movement. He was not performing composure. There is a difference, and it matters, between a person who is afraid and constructing a facade of calm, and a person who is genuinely moving through a room with the particular economy of someone who has been in difficult places before, and has learned that unnecessary motion is wasted energy. Cale moved the second way. He walked to the standing circle the way he walked into any room he had decided to do work in, with purpose, without haste, with nothing spared for the watching of the room that was watching him. He was carrying a document case. Actual physical documents, not projection tablets, not the standard data formats of contemporary legal proceedings. The sight of physical paper in that chamber produced a small reaction from the nearest gallery tier, a ripple of something between amusement and disbelief. He set the case on the ledge at the circle's edge, opened it with the same tidy efficiency he brought to everything, and looked up at the chamber. 300 people looked back at him. A human male, lean and weathered in dark professional attire, standing in the center of the most formal legislative space in the Rethassian system, preparing to argue on behalf of himself that he deserved to be there. "I'd like to begin with the original text of the compact," he said. He did not say please. He did not qualify the request or apologize for it. He named the document he needed, clearly and without preamble, the way a craftsman names a tool when he is ready to use it. In the hall's particular acoustics, his voice carried without effort, not loud, simply precise. There was a pause, the texture of a room deciding whether to take something seriously. Then the archive projection came alive in the center of the hall, and the original compact text appeared in the air above the standing circle, the characters rendered in the deep gold of official documentation, ancient and legible and perfectly preserved. "Section 14, Cale said. Subsection 3. The projection shifted. The relevant passage enlarged until it was readable from the upper galleries. He read it aloud. His pronunciation of the old Rethassian was careful and exact. I had taught him certain passages myself in the weeks before the session, and he had studied them the way he studied everything, with total attention and no vanity about the difficulty. In the hall, the sound of a human voice reading the foundation text of the dynasty in its original language did something to the air. Not silence. The gallery was still full of the small sounds of a large room in session, but a shift. The particular recalibration of a room realizing that the speaker is not going to be as easy to dismiss as anticipated. "A being of recognized standing," he read. He let the pause after the phrase do its work. "Within the frame of galactic law," another pause. "I'd like to address what that has meant, historically in practice." He walked the chamber through 12 centuries of compact jurisprudence, not summarized, not interpreted through the filter of a legal argument already constructed. Primary sources, the original session records, arbitration outcomes, the formal correspondence between past empresses and their legal bodies, drawn from the archive he had spent 2 weeks in. He cited each document by its reference number before the archive clerk retrieved it, which meant that every document he would call was already in his memory in order with its number. He had not been browsing in that archive. He had been building a sequence, one document at a time, for 2 weeks, in silence. The first hour was methodical and thorough, and by design not surprising. The historical record of what recognized standing had meant in practice was not dramatic. It was a series of careful, well-reasoned decisions across many centuries, each one consistent, each one citing the last. What Cale was building in that first hour was context, the understanding that would make the second part of his work visible in its correct light. You cannot show someone what is missing from a picture unless they first understand what the picture is supposed to contain. I watched Seth during the first hour. He was patient in a different mode than before, not the patience of a man preparing to act, but the patience of a man watching something he has already categorized and waiting, without much interest, for it to conclude. His expression was pleasant and slightly distant, the expression you wear at a proceeding that is going precisely as expected. He consulted quietly with his legal counselor twice. The consultations were brief and apparently unremarkable. The gallery had grown quieter, not more attentive, necessarily. Some of the senior advisors had the carefully maintained expressions of people who were being careful not to show that they had stopped listening, but the small sounds of a distracted room had diminished. The acoustics of the hall tend to amplify inattention. The fact that those sounds were fading meant something was holding the room's focus without their permission. Cale moved into the second section of his presentation, which addressed the specific precedents Seth had cited in the petition. This was where I began to understand what 2 weeks in the archive had produced. For each of the 4 precedents Seth had named, and they had been well-chosen precedents, genuinely applicable, genuinely supportive of the petition's argument if read at the level of their conclusions. Cale retrieved the original record. Not the summary version, not the citation as it appeared in the legal literature, but the full transcript of the original session that produced the finding. He read the relevant passage in context, the full argument that preceded it, the full discussion that accompanied it, the full statement of conditions under which the finding applied. What emerged in each case was that the precedent meant something different in its original context than it meant in Seth's application of it. Not dramatically different. This was not a case of fabricated citation. The difference was the kind you find when you read carefully rather than selectively, the kind that requires genuine familiarity with source material over a period of time, the kind that is easy to overlook if you only read summaries, and easy to miss if you are reading to confirm rather than to discover. Seth's pleasant expression remained, but I saw him look at his legal counselor again, and this time the exchange was longer, and the counselor's response to whatever Seth said was a particular stillness I recognized from the other side of difficult sessions. The stillness of a person who has found something they had not anticipated and is taking a moment to assess it. Cale continued. He moved through the precedent analysis with the same economy he brought to everything, no flourish, no pause for effect beyond the natural pauses of a man who understands that the material speaks more powerfully than commentary. What he was demonstrating, document by document, was that the legal architecture of the petition was built on a particular reading of precedent that was defensible when reading summaries and did not survive contact with the primary sources. This was not fraud. It was something that in some ways required more careful construction than fraud. It was selective reading, the kind that a brilliant and patient person assembles over years, by choosing which parts of the record to make visible and which parts to leave in place, unfiled. The hall absorbed it. The quality of the silence had been changing for the past hour in a way that was difficult to name but impossible to miss. It was the silence of a room that has begun to recalibrate, but has not yet completed the process, still holding the shape of its original assumptions, aware that those assumptions are under pressure, uncertain how much pressure they can absorb before something changes. "I'd like to move to the matter of the petition's origin," Cale said. His voice had not changed in pitch or pace since the beginning of the session. This was, I had come to understand over years, one of his most significant qualities. He does not signal the important moments with his voice. The crucial observations arrive at the same register as the routine ones. You have to be paying attention to the content, not listening for inflection. The gallery was paying attention. The petition argues that the question of the consort's standing is a constitutional matter that has concerned the senior advisory body for some time, Cale said. He reached into the document case. "I'd like to understand what some time means." He named a document, archive reference number, date. The archive clerk retrieved it. What appeared in the projection above the standing circle was a piece of sealed correspondence, the kind not ordinarily produced in open session, the kind carrying the mark of privileged advisory communication, and therefore technically outside the scope of what an arbiter could request in standard proceedings. There was a murmur in the gallery, and from below the senior arbiter's position came the beginning of a procedural objection, someone drawing breath to formalize it. "This document is in the public archive," Cale said, before the breath had finished becoming words, "filed under its correct reference number in the standard correspondence index. Privileged advisory communications are exempt from archive access when they are marked as privileged at the time of filing. This document was not so marked." He paused for precisely as long as the sentence required to settle. "I would suggest that was an oversight." He said it without expression. He was already moving to the document's content. The communication was between Subvoice Seth and 3 members of the senior advisory faction, dated 14 months before my bonding ceremony. Before Cale and I had become a matter of public knowledge. Before I had made any indication to anyone outside my immediate household that what I felt had changed in character. The communication discussed, in the careful language of men who believed they were conducting a private conversation, the strategic implications of various scenarios regarding the imperial succession, with particular attention to the consort selection, and the most effective means of ensuring that the next consort came from the approved list that the senior advisory body had maintained for some years. It was not a conspiracy document, not at first reading. It was a planning document, the kind of forward thinking that senior advisors conduct, looking at likely developments and positioning accordingly. But its existence, at that date, demonstrated something specific and unanswerable. The petition had not arisen from constitutional concern in response to an unexpected development. It had arisen from a plan already in place before the thing it claimed to be responding to had occurred. The gallery's murmur distributed itself through the tiers in a different way than before. Not the controlled sound of a room managing its reaction, something less controlled than that. Seth uncrossed and recrossed his legs. I saw it from the dais, a small shift in his seated posture, the kind of movement made not for comfort, but because the body needs to do something and the mind has not yet directed it. In 20 years of watching Dremel Seth manage difficult rooms, I had never seen him make an involuntary movement. The architecture of his self-possession was one of the things that had made him genuinely formidable for 4 decades. Cale named another document. He was methodical about it in a way that was itself a kind of pressure. Not rapid, he did not rush, he did not accelerate as though pressing an advantage before it closed. Each document arrived at the same pace as the one before it, with the same care, with the same quality of attention given to reading it into the record completely before moving to the next. What he was building, I understood by the third document, was not a single revelation. It was an accumulation. An architecture of documented fact, laid down piece by piece, each piece modest in itself, each piece fitting into the growing picture in a way that was making the picture harder and harder to dispute, because the picture was built from the chamber's own words. Correspondence between advisory faction members, discussing legal research funding. Minutes from internal sessions that had been recorded in the official log, but whose full transcripts had not been reviewed in open session. Meetings in which the constitutional question had been discussed in speculative terms years before it was petitioned. A financial allocation within the advisory body's discretionary budget, directed toward a particular legal research firm in the years before the petition submission. Communication with one of the Allied court representatives currently sitting in the diplomatic observer section. A communication that discussed the strategic value of having Allied witnesses present at a particular type of convocation session. That last one produced a response in the gallery that I can only describe as a collective intake of breath that did not quite reach the level of sound. The Allied court representative in question was now sitting with a quality of stillness that was not the stillness of composure. It was the stillness of a person calculating the implications of something at high speed while trying to ensure that the calculation is not visible. Seth spoke. He did not raise his hand for recognition. Senior advisors of his rank have the right to speak without formal recognition, and he exercised it now, his voice measured, pleasant still, but with a precision in it that had replaced the comfortable distance of earlier. He said that the documents being presented were being stripped of their proper context, and that he welcomed the opportunity to address each one in turn and restore that context to the record. Cale looked at him, not a long look, a few seconds of the calibrating attention that I had seen him give the defendant at the Harath proceedings 12 years earlier and on many occasions since. The look of a man who has registered something and is deciding precisely how much weight it deserves. Of course, Cale said, I'll finish the record first. He had 8 more documents. I did not know about the 8th one. I want to be clear about this, because the question of what I directed and what I did not direct has been raised in various forms since, and the answer is this. I gave Cale access to the archive and I gave him time. And I did not specify what he should look for because I did not know what the archive contained. The archive had not been read by anyone outside the advisory body's own legal staff in the relevant sections for many years. There was no reason, or so it had been assumed, for anyone else to read it. The 8th document was filed under a reference number that cross-indexed to a routine administrative matter from 18 years prior. Buried in the kind of location that surfaces only if you follow a chain of archival cross-references that most researchers would have abandoned after the third link, because the chain had the appearance of leading to routine record-keeping, and there was no obvious reason to believe it led anywhere else. Cale had followed it because the reference number pattern was irregular in a way that was consistent with what he had been finding in the archive for 2 weeks. Documents that had been moved from their natural locations to somewhere less visible. Not removed, the archive preserved everything. Moved, recategorized. Given reference numbers that would not surface in a standard search. What it contained was a record of a private discussion, 18 years prior, between Seth and 2 other members of the advisory body, one of whom was now deceased, regarding the management of a territorial succession dispute in one of my empire's outer systems. The dispute had been resolved through an arbitration finding that had favored a particular claimant. The finding had been reviewed and considered correct at the time. No one had questioned it. No one had reason to. What the private communication revealed was that the archival evidence supporting the finding had been selected, and the evidence contradicting it had been quietly misfiled, moved, given different reference numbers, made effectively invisible to any researcher who did not already know where to look. The territorial claimant who benefited from the finding was related to the Seth family through a branch connection that did not appear in standard biographical records, but did appear in the genealogical registry, under a reference number in a format consistent with the others Cale had been following. Cale read it into the record in the same voice he had used for the previous 7 documents. He did not editorialize. He did not pause for effect. He read the document to its end, set it face down on the ledge of the standing circle with the same deliberate tidiness he had shown the petition at breakfast 14 days earlier, and was quiet. The Hall of Concordance absorbed the silence the way the gold-veined floor absorbs sound at certain frequencies, completely, into something deeper than quiet. 300 people were not breathing. I have been in that hall in many conditions. I have stood in it during ceremonial occasions when 500 people held a perfect ordered stillness. I have been in it during genuine constitutional crises when the controlled tension of the chamber was a physical thing, a pressure against the skin. But I have never experienced, before or since, the quality of what the hall held in the moment after that 8th document was set down. It was not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen. It was the silence of a room in which something had already happened, and the room had not yet found the language to acknowledge it. Seth's pleasant expression was gone. What had replaced it was not anger. Anger would have been, in its way, a relief. Anger implies that the person experiencing it still believes they have ground to defend. What I saw on Dremel Seth's face, for perhaps the first and only time in 20 years of watching him in rooms, was the particular expression of a man who has just seen the exact shape of the trap he is standing in. He had constructed that trap himself. He had built its foundation 18 years ago in an archive room, with careful hands and the certainty of a patient man, and he had believed, had every reasonable cause to believe, that the foundation was buried deep enough to outlast any challenge he might face. He had not accounted for a human war crimes arbiter, who had spent his career in the business of finding what other men had tried to make unfindable. He had not, in the end, accounted for Cale at all. Cale turned from the document to face the chamber. Not toward Seth specifically, toward the chamber as a whole, the tiered galleries, the senior advisors in their formal positions, the diplomatic observers frozen in theirs, the upper tiers of functionaries and household staff who were watching with the quality of attention that comes when you understand, without anyone having to tell you, that you are witnessing something that will be recounted for a long time. "I'm finished with the evidentiary record," Cale said. His voice was unchanged from the first word of the session. The same measured, quiet, precise instrument, the voice of a man finishing work he began in the morning. "I'm happy to address questions." Nobody spoke. This was the recognition, not the revelation of the documents. The documents were the mechanism, the pathway. The recognition was this moment. A chamber full of people who had spent 4 years working from a fixed assessment of what Cale Morrow was, and what he was capable of, and what it meant that their empress had chosen him, looking at that assessment now, and finding that it was not the document they had believed it to be. He had walked into their hall, their system, their centuries of accumulated procedure and archived record and galactic law, with a document case and 2 weeks of reading, and he had emerged from within their own history holding the thing they had assumed was safely beyond his reach. The assumption had been the mistake, not the hiding of the thing, the assumption that he could not find it. I descended the throne dais. This was not the protocol. The protocol is for the Empress to remain elevated throughout a convocation session. The dais is the seat of authority, and leaving it during active proceedings carries implications that the precedent-conscious members of the chamber would find significant. I descended it anyway. I descended slowly and deliberately, my household guard shifting in the disciplined confusion of people following a procedure that did not exist, and I walked across the gold-veined floor. the sound of my steps genuinely audible in the profound quiet of the room, each footfall its own small statement. To the standing circle. Cale looked at me when I reached him. He was not surprised. He rarely performs surprise, and I think in this case he had considered the possibility. But there was something in his eyes, a quality that exists in the space between his professional composure and the private self he shares with very few people, that I recognized as the look he gives things he values when they arrive in unexpected forms. Not sentiment, acknowledgement. I stood beside him in the circle, the two of us, together in the space designed for a single accused person to stand alone. I turned to face the chamber, and what I said was not long. I had not prepared an oration. What I had prepared, in the nights of the preceding 2 weeks while Cale was in the archive, and I was doing the other kind of work, the work of governing a system that was watching its empress answer a challenge to her fitness, was the honest version of the thing I had always known and had never needed to state in formal terms before. I told the chamber this. I had chosen Cale Morrow as my consort because I had watched him do exactly what he had just done, and I had understood from the first time I saw it that this quality, the patient, methodical, unanswerable application of documented truth to those who believed the truth was manageable, was the quality I most needed beside me in the governing of anything that mattered. He was a being of recognized standing. He was recognized by me, and as the compact stated in its original text in Section 14, subsection 3, whose full implications the chamber had just heard read into the record, the bond choice of the Empress constituted recognition in the legal sense, had constituted it for 12 centuries, and would continue to do so for as long as the compact held. I watched Thal's face while I was speaking. She was not doing the stoic expression. She was doing the other one, the expression she wears when something has happened that she had not predicted, and she is updating her understanding of the world accordingly. I have seen it perhaps twice in 20 years. It is a good expression on Thal. It means something has genuinely surprised her, and very little genuinely does. The senior arbiters of the convocation conferred in their designated alcove for 40 minutes. I stood in the standing circle with Cale, and we were quiet, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The hall maintained its extraordinary stillness throughout those 40 minutes, as though the space itself understood that what had occurred within it was not the kind of thing that accommodates ordinary noise. The gallery did not disperse. The observers did not consult their notes. The Allied court representatives sat in the particular stillness of people composing, internally, communications they were going to need to send as soon as they were outside these walls. The lead arbiter delivered the convocation's finding in the formal language of such proceedings. What it said, stripped of ceremony, was this. The petition had raised a constitutional question that had been answered by the evidentiary record. The answer was in the Empress's favor, and the petition was therefore dismissed. The matter of documentation presented in evidence, the correspondence, the allocation records, the irregularity in the territorial arbitration of 18 years prior, was referred to the convocation's investigative body for formal review. Seth said nothing when the finding was delivered. He sat in his formal position with the pleasant expression gone, and the calculating patience gone, and something else in their place that I recognized, because I had seen it in other rooms on other faces after Cale had finished reading from a document case. The look of a man encountering the permanent weight of the documented record. You can build carefully and patiently for decades. You can move things to less visible locations in an archive that you believe is only legible to those who already know what they are looking for. You cannot change what the documents say. The archive is complete. It was waiting for someone who knew how to read it. We walked out of the hall side by side, as we had walked in. The retinue reformed around us. Thal fell into her position 3 steps behind my left shoulder, and I could feel, without turning, that she was doing a great deal of internal revision, and doing it in the dignified silence that is her way. The approach corridor has a particular acoustic quality. our footsteps, the quiet movement of the household guard, the settled silence of a building in which something significant has recently concluded, and the building is absorbing it. I was aware of every detail of the moment with the clarity that comes when the body understands, before the mind has finished processing, that something has been decided, and that the deciding is done, and that what remains now is simply life continuing from here. Cale was quiet for the length of the corridor. This was ordinary. He does not fill silence with words it does not need. At the corridor's end, where it opens into the courtyard, and the afternoon light comes through the high arch, amber, late summer, the kind of light that finds the weathered places in a face and makes them clear, he said. The territorial claimant's family. I'd like to look at that more thoroughly when we get back. You think there's more? I think the archive is complete, he said, and I didn't start at the beginning. I looked at him. He was watching the courtyard with the same calibrating attention he brings to everything, already several steps into considering what comes next, because what comes next is where the work is, and the work is what interests him. Not because what had happened today was insufficient, because it had never been about today. It had been about making certain that the thing they had built together was standing on ground that could not be moved, and that meant knowing what the ground contained. 7 years I had known this about him. From the first afternoon at the Harath proceedings, watching him lay a document on the table in front of a man who had believed for 30 years that he was safe. The work was the thing. The patient, methodical, unanswerable pursuit of what was actually true, in the face of whatever resistance the world chose to offer. I had loved that quality before I had a name for what I was feeling, and I had bonded my life to it without ever becoming quite accustomed to the particular way it felt when I was standing close enough to watch it work. Then we'll start at the beginning, I said. He looked at me. The warmth that lives in the private register between us was there, just there, for a moment, as clear in its way as anything that had been stated aloud in the hall behind us. It'll take a while, he said. I'm aware, I said. I have the archive access now. We walked through the arch and into the afternoon together, and behind us the Hall of Concordance held its silence the way it always holds the things it has witnessed, completely, permanently, without interpretation. The gold-veined floor, the carved obsidian walls, the deep record of everything that has ever been said within it, everything that has ever been decided, everything that has ever been moved to a less visible location by men who believed the archive could be managed. It cannot. That was what Seth had never understood in 40 years of managing things. The archive is not selective. It does not choose what to remember. It preserves everything completely in the same patient and indifferent way that truth itself waits, not pursuing, not accusing, simply existing, in whatever location it has been placed, for the person who has the patience and the skill to find it. I have been asked, more times than I can count, why I chose a human. The answer is this: because I saw what he did with a document case in enough time. Because I understood, watching him work, that what the galaxy calls power and what actually moves the world are not always the same thing. Because the patient, persistent, entirely human refusal to accept that important things are unfindable, that buried truths stay buried, that carefully managed archives stay managed, is a force as real as anything I have encountered in the exercise of power, and more durable than most of it. The court called him a soft-world fool. They called a great many things by the wrong names for a great many years. The archive knew better. So did I. There is something I have not described about the 2 weeks Cale spent in the archive, because I did not witness it and only know it from what he told me. Selectively, in the evenings, in the specific way he has of telling me things he thinks are important to my understanding without yet explaining why he thinks so. He told me, on the 7th day, that the Rethassian archive categorization system was unlike any system he had encountered in his career. I asked how it was unlike them. He said that most archival systems he had worked in were designed with the assumption that the material in them would be searched. The access patterns were anticipated. The cross-referencing was built to surface related documents. The indexing was developed by people who imagined a researcher coming to the archive with a question, and the archive's function being to answer it efficiently. The Rethassian system, he said, had been designed by people who thought about the archive differently. They had thought of it not as a retrieval system but as a preservation system. Its function was not to be searched but to hold. Every document that entered it was given a location and a reference number, and it was held there completely, without evaluation of whether it should be easy to find. The indexing was accurate rather than intuitive. If you knew the reference number, you could find the document. If you did not know the reference number, you needed to understand the logic by which reference numbers were assigned, a logic that was itself archived in a document from the system's founding period, and that required careful study to internalize. Cale had spent the first 3 days internalizing it. After that, he said, the archive was legible in a way that the people who had used it for years might not have fully appreciated, because they had learned it gradually and assumed that the difficulty they had experienced was simply the system's natural complexity. To someone who had learned the underlying logic deliberately, from first principles, in a concentrated period, the system had a different character. Its cross-referencing was, in fact, extensive. Documents that were related were connected by reference chains. Following those chains required patience and the willingness to pursue paths that appeared to be leading nowhere for several steps before revealing their destination. He had followed a great many of those chains. Most led where the reference logic suggested they would lead. Some did not. The ones that did not, he said, were interesting. I thought about this when I was standing on the throne dais watching the session proceed, and I thought about the particular expression on his face on the 7th evening, the one that meant something had moved from the category of interesting to the category of significant. He had not told me what he had found. He had told me only that the archive was complete and that they documented everything, and I had filed this alongside the other things he tells me when he wants me to understand that something important is in progress without yet being ready to describe what it is. Standing on the dais, watching him read from documents that the chamber had assumed were invisible, I understood what he had meant. The archive was complete. It documented everything, including the particular fingerprint that deliberate misfilling leaves when you have internalized the logic of a system well enough to see where the logic has been deliberately violated. Documents that should cross-reference to each other, but do not. Reference chains that lead to unexpected locations. Administrative categorizations that do not match the content of the documents they describe. A careful person can violate the logic of an archive. A sufficiently patient person, working from first principles, can find where the logic has been violated, because the violation is itself a form of documentation. This is what I have tried to explain to people when they ask how a human arbiter with observer status credentials walked into the most formally consequential legal proceeding in the Rethassian system and dismantled 4 decades of constructed influence. The answer is not that he is extraordinary in the ways that power typically recognizes as extraordinary. The answer is that he is the specific kind of person who, when told that something important cannot be found, understands this as a description of where the work is, not as a reason to stop. The territorial matter that he raised in the corridor, the one he said he had not started at the beginning of, went to the investigative body's review along with the other referrals from the session. The review took 14 months and produced findings that I will not detail here because they are part of an ongoing process, and the process is not mine to summarize. What I will say is that the archive, accessed from its beginning and read with the understanding that Cale had developed over 2 weeks of concentrated study, contained more than anyone had expected it to contain. The investigators said this to me in their preliminary briefing. They said it with the particular expression of people encountering something genuinely unexpected and recalibrating to accommodate it. I told them that the Rethassian archive was remarkable, that it was complete, that they documented everything. They asked if I had known this before the session. I told them I had been informed of it, yes. What I did not tell them, what belongs to the private record rather than the official one, is that I had known it from the moment Cale said it, on the 4th evening of his 2 weeks in the archive, with the specific expression of a man who has just found the shape of something that has been waiting for someone to find it. I had known it the way I know most things he tells me, not from the words alone, but from the whole of the man speaking them. The patience in the words, the absolute absence of performance. The quality of genuine engagement with a problem that is, to him, not a burden but the thing that makes mornings worth getting up for. I have been asked, more times than I can count, why I chose a human. I chose him because the galaxy has no shortage of power, and has a significant shortage of people who will sit in a room for 2 weeks learning the first principles logic of an archive system they have never encountered before, for the purpose of finding what was deliberately made unfindable, for the purpose of establishing what is actually true. I chose him because I have governing to do, and governing requires knowing what is actually true, and I have found no more reliable instrument for that purpose in 11 years of looking. I chose him because the morning after the session, he made breakfast, and when I came into the kitchen he was already at the stove, and he had the same economy of movement he brings to everything. And the kitchen smelled like something from his home continent that I have never been able to name, but have come to associate entirely with the specific texture of a morning that belongs to us, and not to the court, or the archive, or the 100 years of Rethassian history that will record what happened in the Hall of Concordance on that afternoon. I chose him because in 11 years, he has never once treated the choosing as a condition I owe him, or a debt I carry, or anything other than the simple and mutual fact of 2 people who looked at each other clearly and decided this was where they intended to be. The court called him a soft-world fool. They spent 4 years being careful about it, managing it, building their case against it, and then they spent 5 hours in a room with him and went home to reconsider what they had been careful about. The archive held everything they had said and done and built and buried, as it holds everything anyone says or does or builds or buries in the Rethassian system. It held it patiently, as archives do, for the person with the patience and the skill and the willingness to follow a chain of references to its actual end, rather than the end that appears most likely after the first few steps. He found it. He always finds it when it is there to find. That is why I chose him.